The day my grandmother passed away, the house felt heavier than the autumn clouds hanging above it. She had lived in that small, creaking home for over 60 years, filling every corner with quiet strength, routine discipline, and secrets no one claimed to know. The living room still carried her scent, a faint mix of lavender and wood polish, while the walls held shadows of memories she never spoke of. I remember standing in the hallway, listening to the murmurs of relatives who had barely visited while she was alive, but somehow arrived early when they smelled inheritance. Their voices were sharp with assumptions, greed disguised as concern, and a hunger for something they believed was owed to them. Grandma always knew who would come first after her passing. She knew which hands reached for her only when they wanted something from her. That was why she left instructions behind, a sealed envelope for each family member, delivered only after her funeral. But for me, she left something different. Something simple. Something confusing. A plain white envelope with my name handwritten in her old cursive, the ink faded slightly, as if she'd written it years before she finally decided to give it to me. Everyone else ripped their envelopes open immediately. My cousins grinned when they found small checks and keepsakes. My uncles frowned at photographs she had left them, some filled with warmth, others with pointed reminders of things they had long tried to forget. My aunt found a note instructing her to return the antique watch she had borrowed 10 years ago. Everyone got something that felt like a message, a piece of her unfinished business, or a lesson. However, opened mine and found it completely empty. Just air. Nothing else. No letter. No paper. No instructions. No meaning. My family laughed when they saw my confusion. They whispered about favoritism, about how she must have finally seen that I had grown distant. They assumed she had forgotten to put anything inside. My uncle even joked that maybe she ran out of things to leave. Their laughter echoed like static in the house, mixing with the creaking floorboards as if the home itself disapproved of their noise. But I knew something they didn't. My grandmother would never give an empty envelope by mistake. Not to me. For as long as I could remember, my grandmother taught through silence, choices, and quiet gestures. She believed that people revealed their true nature when they thought no one was watching. She believed every message had a place and a purpose. She did nothing accidentally. So the emptiness was intentional. At first, I tried to dismiss it as sentimentality clouding my judgment. Grief can twist meaning into anything you want to see. But the envelope felt unusually heavy for something that seemed empty. Not physically heavy, emotionally heavy. Like the air inside it carried weight. I held it between my fingers, feeling its soft edges and thin paper texture. One detail kept bothering me. The flap had been sealed twice. A thin layer of glue residue sat beneath the newer seal, as though she had opened it, changed something, and I searched the envelope again under the window's sunlight.
Still nothing.
No writing.
No imprint. No font pencil marks.
No hidden slip between the layers. I tapped it lightly, listening for the soft thud of paper or metal. Nothing. Yet the feeling that the envelope was not truly empty only grew stronger. Later that evening, when the relatives finally left and silence returned to the house, I sat in Grandma's old armchair by the window. The envelope rested on my lap. Outside, wind rustled through the garden she had tended for decades, the flowers bending gently as if bowing in farewell. My grandmother was not a wealthy woman. She didn't have hidden estates or secret fortunes. But she had something far more powerful: stories, secrets, and an uncanny understanding of people. She always said every family had two histories, the one told openly and the one buried beneath shame, fear, or greed. She often hinted that our family had both. As the sun lowered, a strange thought uncurled in my mind. What if the emptiness was the message? What if she wanted me to look deeper? What if her revenge, subtle, quiet, and calculated, was hidden in the absence itself? That night, I returned home with the envelope placed carefully in my pocket. I set it on my desk, staring at it as though it might unfold itself if I watched long enough. But it stayed still, its meaning tucked within a silence I hadn't yet learned to interpret. I tried to sleep, but something pulled at my thoughts, nudging me awake again and again. It wasn't grief. It wasn't fear. It was curiosity laced with the unsettling certainty that this envelope was only the beginning. A starting point to something my grandmother had been planning long before the rest of us realized anything was wrong. Grandma never fought openly. She let time, truth, and patience do the work for her. If she wanted revenge, it would not be loud or reckless. It would be something built slowly, piece by piece, through decisions she had made long before any of us noticed. And somehow, she had chosen me to finish it. As I finally drifted into sleep, one final thought pressed itself into my mind like a whisper. If the envelope appeared empty, then whatever she wanted me to find must be hidden somewhere else. Somewhere only I would know where to look. Somewhere she trusted I would eventually reach. And that was how the search began. The search for a plan years in the making, disguised inside an envelope that held nothing and everything at the same time. Because my grandmother never needed paper to deliver a message. She used silence. And in that silence, her revenge waited patiently. The morning after I received the empty envelope, I woke with the faint sensation that something had shifted overnight. Something small, something invisible, but something undeniably present. The envelope still sat on my desk, untouched and unassuming, as though waiting for me to return to it. I studied it again in the morning light, hoping the brightness might reveal what the dimness couldn't, but it remained as plain as before. Still, the weight of it tugged at me. Grandma always told me that meaning often lived not in objects, but in the spaces around them. Her teachings were not the kind you could understand when you first heard them. They matured with time, unfolding slowly, revealing themselves only when you were ready. And now, staring at what appeared to be an empty envelope, I began to understand what she meant. She was guiding me, even now. I spent the early hours revisiting memories, small, seemingly insignificant moments I had once brushed aside. Memories of her rearranging furniture at odd hours, hiding old letters in forgotten drawers, and scribbling notes on scraps of paper that she tore up minutes later. She left clues everywhere, but never in obvious places. She believed in quiet signals, in messages meant only for the person willing to look for them. The more I replayed these memories, the more one stood out. Her desk drawer. Not the main one. The shallow front drawer was where she kept things people were meant to find, like envelopes, receipts, and grocery lists. But beneath that was a deeper drawer that stuck every time you tried to open it. When I was younger, she used to tell me never to force that drawer open. If it's meant to open, she would say, it will. Her words returned to me now, with unsettling clarity. I drove back to her house, the envelope tucked safely in my jacket. The house was empty without her, still echoing with the fading warmth of a life that had once filled it. Dust floated through the beams of light stretching across the floor, and the silence had a way of pressing into the walls. Standing in her old room, I felt as though she had stepped out only moments before, leaving everything just as she wanted it. Her desk sat quietly against the wall. It was an old piece, scarred by time and softened by years of use. I opened the shallow drawer first, finding nothing more than dried pens, a broken paperweight, and a pair of reading glasses. But the drawer beneath, the deeper one, remained stubborn as ever. Its handle resisted when I pulled, just like it always had. I hesitated, then tried again. This time, it slid open with surprising ease, as though waiting for me. Inside was a single small wooden box. Nothing ornate, nothing grand, just a worn, smooth box with a tiny brass latch. It looked as though it had been opened hundreds of times, the wood polished by the touch of her hands. I opened it carefully, half expecting a dramatic revelation. But inside was something simple, a stack of old photographs tied with string, a faded notebook, and a tiny metal key. The photos were yellowed with time. They showed family members I recognized and others I didn't, people whose stories were lost long before I was born. But as I sifted through them, I noticed a pattern.
Some photos had tiny marks in the
corners, barely visible dots, scratches, or smudges. Others had faint indentations along the edges that resembled symbols. These weren't random signs of aging. They were markings, intentional ones. The notebook was small, its pages brittle. When I opened it, the handwriting inside startled me. It wasn't Grandma's. It belonged to someone else, someone whose letters curled sharply and whose lines slanted with urgency. I scanned a few pages. They weren't diary entries or reflections. They were observations, cold, direct records of family betrayals, financial manipulations, stolen possessions, and silent sacrifices. Stories no one had ever told me. And every entry was signed only with initials. Not hers, but someone else's. The key, however, drew my attention the most. It was small, old, and slightly rusted around the edges. I held it between my fingers, studying its shape. It looked like it belonged to a drawer, a chest, or perhaps something even more hidden. But there was no lock in the desk that matched its size. That was when I realized something unsettling. The box contained nothing specifically addressed to me. There was no note saying these things were meant for me. No writing, no label, nothing personalized. But Grandma had always trusted silence more than instructions. She believed that the right person would understand the right message. And I felt, with growing certainty, that this box was part of her plan. I placed the items neatly back into the box, except the key. Something in me refused to leave it behind. I slipped it into my pocket as if it belonged there. Before leaving her room, one last glance at the desk drawer made my pulse quicken. Something was there, wedged into the corner, almost invisible. A thin strip of paper. It must have slipped out of one of the envelopes or notebooks. Or maybe it was placed there intentionally. I pulled it out. It was blank. Not a single word.
No marquines.
No numbers. Just a narrow piece of clean, untouched paper. The second empty message. And suddenly it made sense. The emptiness itself was the signal. Grandma didn't want to give me instructions. She wanted me to search. She needed me to uncover something that had been buried beneath years of silence, and she wasn't going to hand it to me easily. The empty envelope was step one. The blank slip of paper was step two. And the box, that was the path she wanted me to walk. But her plan wasn't just about revealing a secret. It was about confronting something that had hurt her for years, something she never spoke about, something she couldn't expose while she was alive. As I stood in the quiet of her room, the air around me grew heavier with the weight of realization. Whatever she wanted me to find wasn't just hidden. It was protected, guarded. And whatever lay at the end of this trail of silence was powerful enough to be considered revenge. I closed the drawer, feeling the first tremor of what lay ahead. The key weighed heavier in my pocket than any metal object its size should have. Not because of its mass, but because of the questions it carried. As I left my grandmother's house that afternoon, the old wooden floors groaning under each step, it felt as though the house itself was watching me go, aware of the responsibility now resting in my hands. I returned home with the wooden box, the notebook, the photos, and that mysterious key, laying everything carefully across my dining table. The envelope, the first empty message, sat beside them. The slip of blank paper, the second empty message, rested on the notebook. Together, they formed a pattern that wasn't random. My grandmother had never believed in randomness. Every silence, every missing detail, every blank space was intended. Her revenge was not a strike. It was a trail. A calculated journey. And I had only taken the first steps. I examined the key again. It was small, old, and colder than I remembered. The metal was rough, its grooves uneven, suggesting it belonged to something handmade, not modern. I tried it in drawers, safes, old jewelry boxes, and even a couple of antique locks I kept for decoration. None of them matched. It didn't fit anywhere in my home, which meant only one thing: it belonged somewhere else. But where? My grandmother had lived in that house for 60 years. She had never moved, never traveled far, never kept storage units or rental lockers as far as I knew. She lived simply, quietly, and predictably, or so it always seemed. Yet nothing about this key felt simple or predictable. I turned instead to the other items, looking for clues. The photographs formed a visual timeline of my family's history. Some showed familiar faces: my father, my aunts, cousins, great-uncles. Others showed people who felt distant, their expressions trapped in eras I had only heard stories about. But the markings on the photos were what drew me in. Tiny dots, faint lines, almost invisible scratches, placed deliberately, never randomly. One photo in particular unsettled me. It showed my grandmother standing beside an unfamiliar woman in front of a building I didn't recognize. The building looked like an old office or storage facility. Brick walls, narrow windows, and a sign partially cut off by the photograph's frame. On the bottom edge of this photo, there was a tiny indentation shaped like a triangle. I held the photo under the light. The triangle wasn't part of the aging. It was carved lightly into the surface. The notebook, too, seemed connected to this pattern. Though the handwriting wasn't hers, the content suggested someone was documenting events that involved the family, financial decisions, missing heirlooms, disputes, and actions the family had kept buried. And the initials at the end of each entry. Those didn't belong to anyone I knew. Or at least anyone I thought I knew. I flipped through the notebook again, searching for dates, places, anything that could connect the notebook to the photos. Near the middle, I found a page that made my pulse quicken. A location. Written plainly, as though hiding its importance behind simplicity. A storage address only a short drive from my grandmother's home. The same location printed partially on the building's faded sign in the photograph. It was the first truly tangible clue. And the key suddenly felt less mysterious. I left immediately, the wooden box safely tucked away, the notebook in my bag, the key in my pocket. The sun was beginning to lower as I drove, casting long shadows across the streets I had grown up on. Places I thought I knew seemed strangely different now, as though I were seeing them from a perspective my grandmother had always kept hidden. When I reached the address, I found an old storage facility, rundown, worn, and almost forgotten. The sign was rusted, the paint peeling, but it matched the building from the photograph. The units were arranged in 2 long rows, each with faded numbers painted above their metal doors. The air smelled of dust and old wood. I walked slowly past the units until I reached the one from the photograph. Number 12B. My heart pounded as I stood before it. This was the first door that felt like it could belong to the key. The lock hanging from the latch was old, its metal weathered. I pulled the key from my pocket and held it against the lock. The grooves aligned. I turned it. The lock clicked open. For a moment, the world seemed to still. The wind quieted. The distant sound of cars faded. It was as though everything paused to acknowledge the moment my grandmother had been preparing me for. I lifted the metal door, and it rattled loudly as it slid up. Dust swirled in the air as the interior slowly revealed itself. The storage unit wasn't empty. Not even close. Inside were boxes. Dozens of them. Labeled with names, dates, and symbols I recognized from the photos. At the back stood a filing cabinet, old and dented, with papers sticking out of the drawers. Beside it sat a large trunk, locked with a latch identical to the one outside. Whatever was in here, she had been gathering it for years.
But why?
I stepped inside cautiously, feeling the floor creak beneath my feet. I opened the first box, expecting old journals or forgotten keepsakes. But instead, I found documents, bank statements, legal papers, letters, receipts, each detailing transactions and decisions made by various family members. And every document had notes written in the notebook's handwriting, the same cold, precise script. The boxes weren't keepsakes. They were evidence. Evidence my grandmother had been collecting. Evidence of lies, theft, betrayal, manipulation, committed by the same people who had laughed at my empty envelope. Her silence wasn't a lack of action. It was preparation. But for what? I opened another box. Inside were more photographs, more documents, and a folder labeled with my father's name. My breath caught as I picked it up. The folder was thick, packed with records. At the bottom of the unit, leaning against the wall, was something I hadn't noticed at first, a large, flat board covered with pinned papers, strings connecting certain points, dates linking to names. My grandmother had built an entire investigative map, a map of the family's darkest truths. She wasn't seeking revenge for a single betrayal. She was exposing an entire system of them. I stood there in the dim light, trembling as the reality sank in. The empty envelope wasn't a gift. It was an assignment, and I had just unlocked the first stage of her revenge.